Welcome to Tutorial CU. My name is Yannick and you have clicked on this video because you are interested in Angular. During the next hours you will get an introduction into Angular software development. You will learn everything very practical, so you can just follow along and you will learn Angular hands-on. Now Angular is one of the most popular front-end frameworks out there and it's a great choice to get started and learn it. Before we dive right in, let me tell you that if this video here receives 1,500 likes within 3 months after uploading it, we will create an additional video about Angular where we cover 25 interview questions. So if you want to see that video, go ahead and smash the like button right now. And make sure to subscribe to our channel so that you no longer miss any high quality programming courses, right? Never forget, our goal is to turn you into an expert software engineer. And also, please go ahead into the comment section and tell us why you want to learn Angular. Why do you need it? Alright, and that said, let's get started. Let's dive right into Angular. Now let's get started with this Angular course. And before we set up our development environment in Angular, let's really talk about what Angular is. It's just a short introduction, but Angular is a front-end framework which you can use to build web applications. And you can build single-page applications, it's in short SPA, and a single-page application gets downloaded by the browser once you visit the page, and then changes are handled locally instead of, downloading the entire web application or website over and over again only because you're clicking a button or a link, for example, right? So in Angular, you create a single-page application, and when you host it and you visit that application or any other user visits that application or website, then the browser downloads the entire application and handles the changes locally. So this really speeds up the overall user experience. For sure, during this course, we will dive deep into every Angular topic which is important. So now let's switch over and set up our development environment and start developing single-page applications or web applications using the Angular front-end framework. Okay, so in order to start using Angular, we for sure need two things. First of all, we need Node.js for compilation. So if we want to, build our Angular project, we want to use Node.js for that. So simply search for Node.js on Google or go to nodejs.org if you haven't installed it already, right? So right now we're using the latest version, which is 16.16 in long-term support. So this is what we are using right now. So go ahead, download and install it. And for sure, we also want to install a code editor. So some sort of IDE, which we can use to build our Angular project. And we want to use Visual Studio Code in this course. So for sure, you can go ahead with any other IDE which you want to use, right? There are some others out there, but we will use Visual Studio Code. So go ahead. If you follow along in this video because you want to get started with Angular, go ahead and also download Visual Studio Code because then you can really just follow along with me and do exactly the same stuff that I am doing too. So download Visual Studio Code and install it. Okay, so after installing Node.js and Visual Studio Code, go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code and then you should come to a screen similar like this. Maybe you have that, get started screen, but that's not important at all. Now what we need to do is we need to do two things. First of all, check for the Node.js version that you have now installed to verify that the installation was successful. And we need to install the Angular command line interface so that we can really use some Angular comments to create new projects and all of that. In Visual Studio, you have a terminal, so go ahead to the very top, terminal and then new terminal. You can for sure also use the CMD, but we will use this one now because it's directly integrated in Visual Studio Code. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to check for the Node.js version. So what you want to write down is you write down Node and then as a flag you take V for version. Now let's see what version we got installed, and you can see we got 16.16. Awesome. So Node.js got set up and installed successful. That's the first part. And next up, we now want to install the Angular CLI. And for this, we will use the NPM, which is the Node Package Manager. right? And if you have no clue about that, don't worry too much. NPM is just like a huge library with a lot of frameworks and packages out there. And one of those packages is Angular. So what we do now, to keep it really in easy terms and easy words, we will now install Angular on the machine. So use npm, which is the node package manager, run the install command, npm install globally. So take the global flag, and the package name is called @angular/CLI. I will just show you this in a second. However, now let's hit enter, and this will force the node package manager to install the Angular front-end framework. So here we have npm, it's npmjs.com, right? Node package manager, and we can, for example, search for Angular, and you will be able to see some Angular packages like @angular/CLI, the one we have just installed. We can also find like @angular core. It's developed by Google, right? So Angular is developed by Google. And yeah, this is where the stuff is like hosted, right? So here are really a lot of packages out there, not only about Angular, about really a lot of other stuff too. And if you want to install anything, you can search for it and, well, run the npm command. Like if I click on that, you can see on the right side the installation command npm-i, which is for install for sure, @angular/CLI. So nearly exactly what we have done. And you can see, well, weekly downloads 2.5 million. That's amazing, right? So Angular is very, very popular. Now switching back to Visual Studio Code, and you can see that npm, well, installed our Angular CLI successful. He has added 29 packages. Some other stuff got removed, don't care about that. It's just like Angular got installed right now, or the Angular CLI, and that's for sure what we need to have. Before we continue setting up our Angular project, I want to tell you that we now offer our course library in a subscription-based model. If you subscribe right now, you get instant access to all of our courses, including the complete Angular course. It has 4 hours more in total than this YouTube video here. You also get access to all future courses too, for sure. So what we suggest is that you start your free 7-day trial right now, start the Angular course over there, and afterwards start the ASP.NET course or the C# Masterclass in case you don't have any prior C# programming experience. And if you are happy with the subscription, you can simply continue learning and enjoy all new courses that get added to the library. And if you don't like it, for whatever reason, you can simply cancel the subscription at any time. So start your free 7-day trial now. Simply click on that info card which is popping up right now. Or in case you are interested in C# and you want to become a true senior developer, we can recommend you our 21-day challenge. It's about Angular and ASP.NET Core, and you will learn how to build full-stack applications in this course. The course has a really huge scope. It teaches you a lot of stuff. In fact, you will learn how to build complete real-world applications using Angular and ASP.NET Core. And in that course, you will build a complete flight booking portal from scratch. So if you are not only interested in learning Angular to become a front-end developer, but also interested in getting a huge step beyond this, becoming a true senior developer or full stack developer, you should definitely check out our ASP.NET Core and Angular 21-day challenge. I mean, we got a huge page right over here which is telling you everything in detail, right? I cannot recommend it more because this one will make you absolutely job ready for any web development scenario. You can find the link to this premium course in the description below. Now let's create a new project right here inside of our terminal. And what we want to do is we want to use the ng-new command. So ng means Angular, right? So everything what you can read about ng is always related to Angular. And then new will create a new project. So ng-new, let's call it to-do list. Let's hit enter. Now you can see, or you might see if you are on Windows, that error here cannot be loaded because running scripts is disabled on this system. Now we need to run another command to enable this execution policy for our current system. So if you got that error, just write down set execution policy, add a flag called scope, set the scope to current user, and add another flag, execution policy, and set the value to remote signed. So set execution policy, scope, current user, execution policy, remote signed. Now hit enter. And once you run the set execution policy comment, you can run the previous comment, which was ng new to-do list. And now let's hit enter. And it now asks us if we want to add routing to our Angular project. Let's now hit yes. We will get to that point later on when we talk about routing in Angular, right? So right now it's not important, just write down yes and let's hit enter. You can now see that it asks us which kind of style sheet we want to use, and we want to go with custom CSS right now, which is the cascading style sheet. So simply hit enter again. Now it really creates a new project for us. You can see that inside of a to-do list folder, we get the app module, TS, app component, and all of that, and we will discover all of this in detail. So now the project got created, but it's still installing some sort of dependencies, so packages which are required for Angular. This is why npm here is installing so many packages. Awesome. So now for me, the packages are installed. Now next up, let's see how we can start our application and take a look on what, well, this comment has really created for us. Now let's continue and run our application. First of all, we need to open up the project. You can see that something here got created in to-do list / source assets and all of that. So we got a main folder or root folder, which is called to-do list. In Visual Studio Code, let's open up a new folder, and it will automatically open up the documents folder, which will be like the main folder where your projects are saved by default. You might have changed that previously if you have worked with Visual Studio, right? So go to the destination where your project got created. For me, it's here, to-do list. I just select that folder, and that is for sure the default saving path or creation path for a new project. Now, before we really discover what we have here, right? Because we got some stuff, we got some node modules, we got a source folder, and inside there we got our scripts, and here we got some configuration files. But before we discover all of this, let's simply go ahead and start our application. So open up a new terminal again, and for starting an Angular application, you want to use the command ng serve, right? So Angular is a web application, and web applications are getting served on your local host, for example. So let's hit enter, give it a moment to process the comment. And once that's done, you should see that everything here worked fine. Browser application bundle generation complete. And then you can see that the build started here at that time. It took 26,000 milliseconds. And now Angular Live Development Server is listening on port localhost, right? So open your browser on HTTP localhost. You can just hover above this, hold down Control and click. You can see follow link, right? So let's do that, Control left click. And here is our application. So this is like the default template that you get when you create a new project. And you can see to-do list app is running here, right? And you can see it's hosted on port 4200 for me. Localhost means like 127.0.0.1. So this is like the other word for localhost, right? So you can write it down either way. However, as I said, an Angular application needs to be hosted anywhere, and in this scenario here, it's hosted in the localhost. This is how you can start your application, and if you make changes, they get updated here. So now next up, let's see what we got in our project. When we take a look at our application again, all of what we can see here on this main page or on this single page, right? Because right now we only have that here, needs to be anywhere written down in our project. So let's discover where this, website, what you have just seen is located. Open up the source folder. We will mainly, walk around in this folder and open up the app folder. And inside here, you can find the app component.html, the app component.css, and the app component.ts. Right? Angular is for sure based on TypeScript. We will cover that. So open up the app component HTML right now. And you can see the content below is only a placeholder, blah, 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 right? All of that is like really what we just have seen. We have some style inside here. If you're familiar with basic HTML, what you definitely should be, right? It's just like styling. And when we scroll even more down, we will get to the toolbar, which is for sure on the top. We got that welcome here. We got the card highlighting with that rocket ship and then the name of our application. You can see that here, app is running. You can see we already got some data binding here, but we will cover all of this. Now, what we want to do is we just want to remove everything here because we don't need it, because we really want to get started from scratch. However, the entire site that you have just seen when you started your application is inside of that single HTML file. And one thing already, which I can tell, is that Angular is based on components. When you create a new Angular project, you will automatically have one component created by default, which is the app component, right? So, and inside of that app component, we have the content which you just have seen. However, let's get rid from all of that. Let's create a single div. Let me zoom in, press Ctrl and plus if you would also like to do that. Zooming in, right? And let's simply write down here app component. Now let's save this and revisit our application. Now open up terminal, new terminal, and write down ngserve again. Make sure that the other terminals are closed if you have them opened. If not, you will get a message which is telling you that that the current port is still getting used, which means that you can just go ahead and revisit that page, that old page, because your application was still running. No problem, however, just give it a second to compile the application. Let's follow along with that. Click here. And as I said, you can now see an empty page, which is just displaying app component. So inside of that single component, we now have no other content than this simple paragraph right here. Okay, so your key takeaway right now should be that you have understood that Angular is displaying content inside of components. And we can reuse all of these components wherever we like, right? So just imagine that you don't really want to repeat your design and all of that 5 or 6 times just because you need it at different places in your application. Instead, you create the component one time and then really use them like blocks and set them into specific positions at your application, all of that. So think about components like building blocks. That's all you need to understand right now. So next up, let's start with creating some user interface for our to-do list, because we now have cleaned up our default app component, right? We removed everything because for sure we are starting here from scratch. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to include some CSS, which for sure is about styling. So if you have no clue about CSS and HTML, please go ahead. You need some knowledge for Angular, because we cannot start really with basics of HTML and basics of CSS, because Angular is for a little bit more advanced web developers already. So HTML and CSS are really very, very basic, and you can watch any video about that, like 20 or 30 minutes, that will be enough. However, we also got TypeScript here, which will get covered after this video. Instead of writing all the CSS code down here, which is quite boring, I will copy it from our GitHub repository. You can also do that. Inside of that GitHub repository, you can find a commit for each important step with like, with an information where you can see copy from here, right? And here is the GitHub repository. You can find it at github.com/tutorials/Angular -course -to-do list -app. And there you can find the commit history. It's here right now because I just really created that project just some minutes ago. You can see that because I will create it all over the way while I record this course. So right now for sure there's nothing, but if you later on click on that link or go to that repository, it will be full with some commits. And here you can then find the code you need to copy. So next commit, which I will create, is like about that CSS part, and then you can simply go ahead, go on that commit, find that CSS file and copy the content, and then you got the CSS code. Now we have that copied here and pasted, so our CSS file is fine. And one thing I already want to say is that each component by default contains 4 files. One for CSS, so styling, one for HTML, we call that the template, one for the actual TypeScript code, which is appcomponent.ts right here, and one for spec, which is mainly used for testing. Okay, so now we got CSS done here. Next up, I will close that CSS file, open up the HTML file. We got that app component paragraph right here, and instead of this, we will now bring in a table here, right, for our to-do list. So let's remove app component and create a table here for our to-do list. Inside of that div, we will add a CSS class, and the class is called container. Now, we really don't want to get into that too much. And inside that div, that first div, we have another div, and that one has a class which is called to-do list. And inside that to-do list, we have an input group. Again, you can just follow along, watch this, and then copy it from the GitHub repository. You don't have to really like copy paste it while I write it down. You can for sure do that, or you can write it down while I write it down, but you can simply watch me doing it and then in the end copy paste it. I think that would definitely make more sense, and you will not make any copy paste mistakes while just watching and trying to do what I do here. Okay, so we have a div, and inside that div, which is actually a class input group, right? It's our form which we can use to add and delete something, for example. We got an input, and that input is type text. So what should be added to our to-do list, right? A placeholder, we do to-do, there we go. And then we have a button here, and that button also has a class, and the class is set to add button. And all of those classes, we can find them in the CSS file. There we go. So one container, inside that container, to-do list. Inside of that to-do list, we have an input group. Inside of that input group, we have an input field and a button. Awesome. Now afterwards, right below that input group, we will create the actual table. And inside of that table, we have one table row, so tr. And inside of that table row, first of all, give it a class, which is even. We have a table data. And inside that table data, we have a pre. So pre, visit, and for example. And then after table data, we have one more table data. You will see why we have it like this just in a second. And we have 2 buttons. So let me copy that button here, paste it 2 times, adjust the content. So that's, that one here is like X for delete. And this one here is done. And for the top one here for add button, we can add a plus sign, for example, right? So that we have some content there. Now this is remove button, and this is done button. So let me just recap this. Here at the very top, at the to-do list, we have an add button. And right below, inside of that entry of our to-do list, we have a remove button and a done button, right? Now let's just copy over the complete table row, because one is even, and let's create one more which is odd. So this is the second one. Let's call it call that, for example. And again, we have remove and done. So the only thing right here is like we're adding another class which is odd. Right now we are for sure writing all of that hard coded, right? So we just bringing that in. Later on we will for sure make all of this bound to real data, so that we don't have that only hard coded here. Awesome. So now let's copy both of them again, so that we have table row to table row, so that we have 2 new entries, one for even, one for odd. Let's copy that over, let's paste it in, let's adjust that. So instead of visit n 2 times, we can say go to gym. Probably it won't happen, but however, next up we got wash the dishes, and we can create one more. So simply go ahead and copy the even one again. And this is why I say just watch me doing it and then later on copy it from the GitHub repository, because it's like we're jumping through it, copy pasting, you know. HTML is very long and really not that easy to read if you just scroll through it. So don't get lost along the way. Just we're not doing any crazy stuff right now. You're not missing anything if you just watch me do it and then copy it later on, right? So just listen to what I'm explaining here. That's more important. Last one that we have is not go to gym, it's shop for the party. Awesome. So now let's save it like this. You can see a hot reload took place. So once I make a change and hit Ctrl S for saving, you can see that the build fires again and the changes that I made are getting compiled. So now let's go to our application and take a look. All right, and this is the result that we will then see. So this is only HTML and CSS. So the structure is nice and we also got the styling, but we have no functionality. So I can click on the buttons, but nothing happens. And when I write down something here into our input field, you can actually see that nice shadow effect then on focus, which is cool. However, if I write down hello world, for example, and I click on the add button on the right side, you can see that nothing for sure happens. And this is where the real fun begins, because we will now dive deeper into TypeScript and Angular so that we can add functionality to our application. Now on the left side in our Explorer, open up the app component.ts. TS stands for TypeScript. And the programming language that you can see here, that is TypeScript. And if you are familiar with any programming language like C#, Python or JavaScript or whatever, or well, at least a little bit more advanced JavaScript, you will have an easy time on learning TypeScript, because it's very, very close to C#, for example, but also very close to JavaScript. And it adds just some additional functionality, and the pattern or the syntax, how it's written down, is a little bit different. So next up, I will give you a brief introduction into TypeScript. So for example, just like a C# file or Python file or whatever, we have that file extension. And instead of CS or Py, we have TS for TypeScript. And as I said, TypeScript has many similarities to C#, for example. Here we have a class, and that class is called app component. And every code, like functions or variables or properties or whatever, has to go in between of the curly braces, which you can see right here. So code which is related to app component class should be inside of the curly braces. And to make a class accessible from the outside of this file, we have to export it. For this we use the export keyword right here. Be aware, TypeScript is case sensitive, so we have to write it in lowercase here. Inside of a class you can define a field such as title of type string right here, right? So title colon of type string semicolon. We can also set a default value for this field, for example, and we can change it as we need it. So here we have a title, and the title is set to app and it's of type string. And TypeScript automatically infers the field type when you initialize the field with a default value, as we have done it right here. So once we initialize the value with app, we don't have to define that it's of type string anymore, because, well, TypeScript is intelligent enough to see that app, like with that single quotes, is a string. So it automatically sees, okay, title is of type string because app is a string. So let's skip defining the type right here. And based on the default value, it infers that the type of this field is string, as I already said. Now we can also for sure create arrays, exactly in the same way like we would do it in other programming languages. So here we have a field called items of type string array, and inside of that array indicated by the array brackets, so you can see that, right? We have an item 1 and item 2. So this again is of type string, but array. And since the type is inferable from the initial value, we can again omit the type definition here. This is how we can define a method inside of a class. So if you only know JavaScript, then you might want to consider using the term function, right? So in JavaScript you have a function, and in C#, for example, it would be a method. So the termination is different here. However, the function that we have, or method, is called log. It has a parameter of type string, which is called text, and the return type is set to void right here. So this is a method in TypeScript. We can easily define variables in method bodies just as we do it right here. So we have a variable of type string with the name message, and the initial value is message plus the parameter of the function, which is called text. Just like fields, we can also here skip defining the variable, so we don't have to include the type here. Now let's call the log method of the console class to display the message on the browser console. It looks just like in JavaScript, right? Methods are public in TypeScript by default, that's important. So if you want to make it private, we have to add the private access modifier. Like fields and variables, you can omit method return types when they are inferable from what the method returns. So right here we have a sum method, and well, for sure we are returning a plus b here, so it will be a number in the end. We don't have integer or float right here, it's called number in that scenario. And so it automatically, well, indicates or infers that the return type of this sum method should be a number. So we don't have to, well, set the return type to number here, because as with any type that we got, it's inferable. Now remember that this keyword, so this, is mandatory before fields and methods in TypeScript when you want to access them from within a class. You can also omit semicolons as long as you write different comments in different lines. So let me just go back. You can see that semicolon here, right? Or this one, but we can omit it if we just write one comment in one line. So no semicolon here. We have number, string, and boolean. Those are the primitive types in TypeScript. You can also define variables of the type of classes for sure, as you would do it in any other object-oriented programming language, for example. So here we have a class called app_component, and we create a new variable of type app_component, and we assign a new object of that type app_component. We already covered it, but this is how you can define arrays. And here we got everything summed up just a little bit. So you can see you can create a number array, string array, boolean array, and for sure use your custom class. So, and this is everything what we really want to cover now about TypeScript, because one of the prerequisites of this course is for sure that you know any programming language. And really, if you know any programming language, if it's Python or C#, C++, C, or whatever, even plain JavaScript, you are most likely to be able to follow along in this course without digging deeper into TypeScript programming. Awesome, now that said, let's move on to Angular components, and to code in Angular components, we for sure use TypeScript. Okay, so here we are back at our project app.component.ts, and you can see that add component decorator here. And we will talk about decorators along the way, but first of all, let's really get clear, what is a component? Components are the major building blocks of an Angular application. A component is usually a composition of an HTML file, some optional CSS files, and the TypeScript class. And we just edited the HTML and CSS file of the app component. And then we saw a component class in TypeScript. But how are they composed together? On top of a component class, there's a function named add_component. This function includes low-level information the Angular framework needs to build and run the application. You can see that right here, right? That add_component decorator. It's a function. Inside here we got a selector, template URL, and style URLs. So the add_component function specifies the template and the CSS files for the component class under it, while template URL, well, template is HTML. So the app_component HTML, which we have edited, is the actual template for this component. Same goes to style URLs app_component.css. And the selector is app_root. So we can use an HTML tag, write down app_root, and it will refer to this component. No worries, we will see that in action. However, the component handles the logic behind the template the user interacts with. So if I click on a button, for example, in the HTML, then we can run a function or a method inside of our app_component TypeScript class. Now let's see how this works. Now let's talk about the one-way data binding. Here in our app_component.ts, I got that opened on the left side so that you can follow along, right? app_component.ts. we're in the TypeScript file and you can see a field here, right? So title equals to-do list. So this is a string field which we can use to display it in our HTML template. So if we want to access this property, title, we can simply go to the related template, which is appcomponent.html, right? I got that opened here, but you can find it on the left side here, appcomponent.html. Let's go into that. Right here at to-do list, I want to go into that and want to display the title here. So if I write down title like this, it's just a simple string. So if I save it and run it, then you will see that it's just handled like a paragraph. So what we want to have instead is for sure the value of title right here. I want to show you how this works just in a second, but let me just show you what you can see if you just write down title. For sure, you can see title right here because it's just a paragraph, just a string inside of the HTML content. So instead of doing that, we want to use binding. Let's add double curly braces here, just like this. And in that way, if I save it, we bind it to the property value, app component title, right? So whatever the value of title is will be displayed. So right now it's to-do list, right? So title here will be replaced with the value to-do list. Now let's take a look. And as you can see, we get to-do list right here. And this is called one-way data binding. And the component and the template can interact just like that. And this is one of the Angular framework features, right? So don't forget about that. It's called data binding. Here in our template, right? Don't forget template is HTML of the component. We have hard coded all the tasks on the to-do list. Now let's bind them to a new field we will add to the component class instead. Let's create an array of strings for the tasks so that we don't have to use them hard-coded right here, right? So we want to have that modular and dynamic. So here we have a field called title. For sure, we can go ahead and create one of type string array. So let's call it tasks and the value is a new array. And inside that array, we can write down like visit and another value, call that, just what we have inside of our template. Go to the gym, wash the dishes, and again, shop for the party, for example. Okay, so now we have an array here, right? And as you know, if we assign an initial value, it's automatically inferred, so we don't have to say, well, type of string array, for example, right? We can definitely do that. You can see it's still compiling and everything is working fine here, but let's remove it because it's easier to read if it's just getting inferred automatically. Awesome. So now for sure, we can also use this tasks property here as we have used the title. So let's switch over to our template and let's replace the hard-coded tasks with the array items. So let's start with the first one, which is here, visit and, again, two-way data binding. So we want to use double curly braces, refer to tasks, and then for sure we use the array brackets and refer to the first item in the array, which is for sure on index 0. Now let me copy that over and let me just call that, do that instead, 1. Right, we're doing it from scratch. For sure we can use a loop and all of that. We will see that just in a second. Wash the dishes will be 3 and shop for the party will be 4. There we go. Now let's save and take a look. As you can see, for sure it's still the same, but all the values are loaded from the component and not from the hard-coded values we had before. So right now all of these elements here are coming from the tasks array of the component. Now for sure we can improve that a lot, right? We don't want to hard code this even here, so tasks 4 is also hard coded, right? Instead we want to for sure iterate through it because we can then build exactly the same list just by, well, using a loop and creating all of the template once instead of copy paste, copy paste, copy paste. I mean, that totally makes sense because you never know how many tasks you really have in the end. So this is definitely something that should be handled by a loop. And what we want to do here is we want to now go ahead and remove everything which starts after the first element. So tasks 0, and then we get a button, and a button table row is ending here. And then we can remove all other table rows because we will automatically create them inside of a loop. Awesome, so it will now look like this. Let me just show you that. So I save it and go to the actual application. This is what it should look like now. So we only have visit n. And now let me show you how you can create a loop. So right here in our table row, because we want to create a new tr table row for each element in our array. This is why we create the loop inside of that tr element, right? Because as I said, let me just repeat that. For each element in the array, we want to create a new table row. So we say asterisk and then ng for. So we create a for loop here, right? Don't forget that asterisk ng for. And now let's write the condition, let task of tasks. So what simply happens here is, just think of it if you're coming from C#, for example, of a for each loop, right? So for each task in our tasks array, do the following. And if you think about it of a for loop, then we just iterate through each task inside of the tasks array. However, we can now use that task object here instead of using that binding. So let's just remove the array index like this so that we directly reference the task. So let me double click on that and you can see it's highlighted, right? So task, task. This is exactly how it's going. Okay, cool. So now what he will do for sure is he will iterate through the tasks array, and then we take the single object, each single object of that array, and display it inside here. And he will now create multiple table rows. So let's see that in action. Okay, and this is now what we got. We got all the elements from the iteration of a single loop from that array. And this is awesome, right? So now you have learned how you can use a loop in Angular to display, well, a collection of elements. All right, so let's just recap this. The one-way binding. You learned to bind a field of a component class to the template. You can see that just right here on the left side, we got the component and the field. And on the right side, we got the HTML template, where we simply use the double curly braces to bind the value of that property, or to bind the property and then display the value, right? Okay, so components can also have methods like other classes. We already talked about this, and this is how you can define a method for a component. So like say hello, and we will do that just in a second, because can you guess the most interesting part about it? Right, we can bind events to them from the template. So as you can see on the right side right here, every time a user clicks this button, the say hello method is called. Now let's do that in practice. So that when we click on the button inside of our HTML, we can force a method to run inside of our component. Okay, so switch over to the app component.ts, and right here we will now create a new method. And don't forget, if you come from JavaScript, you might want to use the term, or you might know the term function. So a method is just like a function, right? So we call that method add, because this method should take care of adding a new to-do element to our list, right? Now we want to call this method once a user clicks on a specific button. For sure, it's the add button. So let's switch over to our template. And here you can see the button class add button. This is our button, which includes the add sign, the plus sign, right? And now we want to bind it to a specific event. And if you are familiar with HTML, you know that a button can have an on-click event, right? And we will use it here in a similar way. So what we do is we say parentheses click. So this is the event. And then you can see we can enter a value here. So once the button gets clicked, we want to call the add method. And again, this is working because we are inside of the same component, right? So appcomponent.ts contains the add method and appcomponent.html. So we are inside of the app component. Here we are inside of the template. Here we are inside of the script, right? So this is why we can use the add method here very, very easy. So what happens now is that once a user clicks on the button, the click event gets called, and the add method listener, which we have now registered, will get invoked, right? If you want to hear it in that termination. Okay, so In easy words, once the user clicks on a button, we will see that add method here being executed. We can write down some logs or something else, but to make it very easy, we can simply print out an alert and let's say hi. So alerts are very easy to see, right? So let's switch over. And once we click or write down something here and click on the plus button here or add button, you can see an alert popping up. Definitely make sure in the background that you have your changes saved. Okay, you can see hi, so this is the alert box, right? Awesome. Okay, so now we can force an action or a method to be called once you click on the button. And this is very important for our main functionality of this application, because for sure we have like 3 actions here. We want to add something, we want to mark something as done, and we have a delete button. And every time we click on a specific button, we want to perform a specific action, right? So this is called event binding. Now, for sure, we really want to add a new task. So let's work on that functionality. And we will now talk about the so-called local reference. And without further explanation, you will just see what it does in a second. So let's switch over to our HTML. Here you can see our input field for a new to-do item. So whatever we write down here, let's say go to the mall, right? And you click on the plus sign later on the add button, you will add it to the list. So what we want to do is whatever we write down here into the input field, let's say go to the mall, we want to let the add button know that the value, right? So that when we click add, it actually submits the value from the input field. And we will do that by using a local reference. So use the hashtag sign we got right here and then call it new task. Now we can use that reference inside of the button click event. So here inside of our add method, we can now use new task dot value. And new task is an input field and the value is whatever we write down into that input field. Now he's complaining because our add method right now does not take any parameter. So let's switch over, or let's say first, let's switch over, scroll down to our add method and let's add a new parameter here. So new task of type string. New task is just the name that we can provide. It doesn't have to be named exactly like this, right? But new task is the best possible way because we want to add a new task. That makes the most sense. And now instead of, well, displaying alert hi, we can for sure display whatever the value of new task is, just for some simple debugging. Awesome. Let's go ahead and check this out. Here we are in our application. Go to the mall. Let's hit add and you can see go to the mall. So now this is a local reference. Let me just explain you that one more time. Here we got the input field and we add a tag to it, which is like new task. Just like an ID, think of that. And then inside of the button, we want to submit the value of that input field because, well, we want to know what the new task is, right? And so we just use that ID to get access to that input field and then take the value. So as I said, new task is an HTML. You can see that on the top right side here, HTML input element. And this HTML input element has a property called value, and this is whatever you write down into that input field. So if I write down hello world, the value of that input field is hello world. Awesome. So don't forget that it is called local reference. Okay, to finish up this functionality, we for sure really want to add a new task to the array. So let's switch over to our script here, to our TS file. And inside of that add method, instead of showing an alert, we for sure want to go ahead and append this string to the array. So what we do is we call this, and this is really, really important. So you have to use the this keyword to refer to this object, to this app component in that instance, right? So this dot tasks is our array field for sure. Dot push. You know that from JavaScript, right? If you want to add something to an array, you need to use the push function or push method, and we want to add the value from our parameter, right? So new task. Awesome. You can use a semicolon if you want, but you don't have to. Let's save it like this, and again, take a look at the application. Great. So let's go to the mall here. Let's hit on the add button and you can see go to the mall, and we can for sure span that, right? Absolutely no problem. And once we update or restart our application, for sure this will be gone because we're just saving it during runtime. So once, as I said, for example, save it, it will regenerate and compile again. When you update the page, you can see that it's gone for sure, because those values here are hard-coded, because we have them integrated directly here. So they are kind of hard-coded, and everything else for sure will get added, but it's just, as I said, it's just in memory. And once we shut down the application or just restart or recompile the application, everything for sure gets deleted, because we're not using any permanent storage here. So if you're interested in persistent storage, for example, so if you want to know how you can connect a database and the backend, for example, as I said earlier, we got that 21-day Angular and ASP.NET Core challenge, right? So Angular is used for front end, you now know that, right? And ASP.NET Core is for developing a so-called backend, which also includes a database. So if you really want to build a real-world application where your data is getting stored and saved, and you can update your data and delete information and all of that using a real-world structure, so a database and all of that, you really want to take a look at this premium course. You can find the link to that right now in the info card popping up. This course here really makes you job ready as a junior developer for front-end development, or if you're already experienced as a programmer, this will turn you into a full-stack developer. Great, so from my side, there is no better way out there to progress faster in your development journey. Great, now that said, let's continue. Okay, so now the add functionality is completed. We can write down something into an input field, click on a button, the button calls the add method, we use the value, which we can grab from the local reference, we take that parameter and we push it right into the array, and the data binding system of Angular automatically updates our view so that we can directly see, once we push something to the array, that our template here, the for loop, gets rendered again, and yeah, well, the change is taking effect immediately. So if we push a new element to the array, it will automatically get rendered because Angular has detected a change in the value, and that forces Angular to update and render the changes. Great, so now we have already completed the functionality of adding a new task. Now let's move on and talk about how we can remove a task. So again, we nearly have to repeat all the steps. We need to create a new method with the name remove, for example, for the app component. Then we need to bind the click event. Then we need to confirm the removal from the task, and again, remove the element from the array instead of adding it, right? So let's get started by creating a new method. Let's call it remove. And for sure, we want to remove a specific item. So existing task by name, for example. We don't have an ID or something else. Right now, we just identify tasks by the string or the description, right? So if I say go to the mall is the task, then the description is go to the mall. Okay. Next up, we go to the app component.html. Let's save it right here. And you can see that X here, button remove, right? That class. So this is the button we want to use for binding. So what we do is we simply go ahead again, try to do that on your own, right? If you want to use the click event, what symbols do you have to use? You have to use the parentheses, right? So take that, write down click, this is the event, and you bind it to a method, and our method is called remove, and it takes a value, a string value, right? You can see that right here, and the value we want to submit is the one we are getting from the for loop, so task. Let me explain that again by the example of go to the mall. In our array, we have our tasks, and one of them is go to the mall. So we render it here using data binding. So task is again, go to the mall, and we want to remove it and submit go to the mall. And in the end, our method will take care of removing that string go to the mall from the array, which will result in the fact that our array has one element less, the one where we clicked on remove. And then for sure, everything gets automatically updated, and we can see that the task is then completely gone. Now let's add some sort of confirmation here. So we are done in the template. Let's switch over and take care about the logic. Write down confirm. You can see in a second what that does. Let's add some string interpolation here. Are you sure that you want to remove the following task? And we want to include line break, and then write down $, there we go, existing task. So just like that, or nearly like that, we just need to bring that to the end of the string. There we go. And we need to add double quotes here. Okay, so in that way it should work. Okay, confirm, are you sure that you want to remove the following task, blah blah blah. Let's see what this does in action. We can do that on an existing item, so visit and let's click here. You can see, are you sure you want to remove the following task, visit and. Okay, so now you can see why we used that double quotes. Okay, and if we hit OK right now, for sure nothing happens, but if we click on the board, also nothing happens, right? Now let's move on and add the removal of the task from the array. That confirm here is, well, giving us a return value, so we can store it and say var user confirmed equals to confirm. So we got a Boolean value. Yes, the user confirmed the process of deletion, or no, user did not confirm, right? So if user confirmed, you can write it down like that. So if user confirmed, this assumes that yes, the user confirmed, right? You may know it like this, if user confirmed equals to true, but it's exactly the same if you write it down like this. Okay, and then we want to do remove the task from our array, and again we have to reference this object. So this dot tasks equals to this task. So we take the entire array and filter out all elements except the one that we have to remove, existing tasks. There we go. All right, now let's save it like this and again take a look. Once we click on visit and let me click on the board, it is not happening, right? I got that in German here, but that's not important. It just says abort. Even though my computer is, well, completely set up in English and all of that, it still, however, figures out that I'm located in Germany. All right, now let me hit OK. You can see, well, it works fine. So after confirmation, our if statement is running and we can remove everything from our list. Awesome. So this is our delete functionality. Let's take a look at how we can mark a task as done. Awesome, so now let's continue and take care of the marking a task as done. And for this, we again have to repeat nearly all of the same steps. So let's get started by binding a button click event for a new method, which we call mark as done. So let's do that right here. Let's write down mark as done. For sure, we again need to know which task you want to mark as done. So let's write down task string, save like that, switch over to the HTML template, and here we got the second button, which is done button for sure, and again use parentheses click event. You can see once you've learned the fundamentals, it's most of the time repeating that stuff. However, there are way more features of Angular to discover, but these are really the basics that you can use to build some actual functionality. Now mark as done. And let's submit the task. Awesome. Let's switch over to the TypeScript component. Now let's alert this. So alert the task. Some interpolation here is done. There we go. So that we know which task is actually getting set as done. However, we need to create a class just in a second to really be able to permanently mark something as done, because right now we don't have any field, any property on our task to mark it as complete, because our task is just a simple string, right? So let's see that in action. Let's click on done here. The task visit and is done. Okay, so all of the binding and method calling is working. That's fine. So let's move on now and let's create a class for our task. Okay, in our app component.ts, let's create a new class. So we can do that right at the very bottom of the script here, class task. And inside that we have a constructor, and inside the constructor we have a field, title, value, data type is string. Awesome. Now let me just explain what a constructor is. So if you are familiar with C# or another object-oriented programming language, you're most likely to already know what a constructor is. But in case you're just knowing plain JavaScript or something like that, you don't know maybe what a constructor does. So if we have a task class right here and we create a task object, then we have a so-called instance. So we have an instance of an object, right? So, and once we create an object, so once we create a new task in that moment of instantiation or creation of that object, the constructor gets called. So what we can simply do is we can create a new task and submit some initial values, all right? Just think about it that way. So once we create a new task object from that class here, right, we can submit the initial title, for example. Perfect. So now that we got the data type class task, we can go ahead, scroll up until we come to the tasks array. Right now, those here are really plain strings. Let's set the type tasks of data type task array. So it's no longer a string array, it's now a task array. Now we can no longer say visit and call that. Instead of, we need to create a new task. So we now instantiate or create a new object of type task. And we can submit the initial value visit an, because this is what we have defined in the constructor. So this here is what I'm talking about. Okay, so we create a new task and we submit the initial value for the title. Awesome. So now we can just copy that over. Let me just do it that way and then add the closing parenthesis for the instantiation. Okay, new, if you don't know that keyword, new creates a new object of a specific data type, right? So new task will result, or this here, will result in an instantiation, so an object of that data type task. But that's really more about object-oriented programming itself and not about Angular. However, I know that most of you, and I really mean like 95% or something like that, really are familiar with a lot of advanced programming concepts, and you know what TypeScript is or C#, and you can really work with words like new or construct and all of that. This is why we don't dive too deep into that topic, because Angular is not really for absolute bare bone beginners right now. It's for a little bit advanced programmers who already have some sort of basic programming knowledge for sure. Okay, now that we have our task here, we can scroll down and can see for sure some reference errors here, because right now new task does not, is a string right here, but we cannot push a string into an array of tasks. So this is where we for sure change the data type from string to task. And we will also do that if we scroll down here to remove existing task. We will now handle that by the task itself and not by the title or description. Okay, now our errors, compilation errors here are gone. This is fine. So now let's switch over to our HTML. We don't want to show the task object anymore. Okay, we want to show the task.title. And that is, again, let me show you in our task object, it's that field here, public title. So we want to show the title, very, very important. Now we can create a field, and this is why we just created that class. For the class task here, public is done, and the initial value is false. So let's scroll up, and here in mark as done, we want to go ahead and set mark as done. First of all, we want to change here from string to task, and then say task.isDone equals to true. Awesome. So let's remove the alert. You can now see that we reference that task. It's an object of type task. We set it to isDone equals to true because we have a field for that right here. Awesome. Let's save it. Let's switch over to our HTML. There we go. You can now see that here in the button, click add new task value. We need to adjust that. So what we do for that is we switch over to our app component, go to our add method right here, and we push a new task object. So new task, there we go. And for sure we want to call the constructor and submit new task for the title. And now we want to change that back from new task to be string. That was a mistake of mine. All right, it's just for removing and for mark is done, but for adding, we for sure need a string to create or to build up that new task. All right, I was a little bit too fast there. Awesome, so let's save it like this. In our app component, everything should work fine now. We should not see any errors. So let's take a look at our app, and that's fine. So let's just remove visit n. Awesome, let's add go to the mall. So everything should work fine. Go to the mall, perfect. And if we mark something as done, then we cannot see any visual change, right? I also removed the alert, so we don't get any feedback right now. And even if we would get some feedback, we don't have any visual difference between the done tasks and the remaining undone tasks. So next up, let's talk about how we can use conditional single class binding so that we can make a difference between done tasks and remaining tasks. All right, now let's take care of displaying done tasks in a different way than the remaining tasks. So go to the app component.css. This one is the related styling sheet, right? And let's add a new CSS class. It's really just 2 or 3 lines of code right here. So please go ahead and follow along. Dot is done. And we set the text decoration to be line. There we go, to be line through, right? So, and this is all we have to do when it comes to the CSS side. Now, imagine that we have a CSS class with the name is done, like the one we have just created. And in HTML, to set a CSS class to an element, we pass the name of the class into the class attribute of the HTML element. Angular Framework provides additional features to apply CSS classes based on Boolean values. For example, we can assign the CSS class to an HTML element just like this. We can also remove the CSS class from HTML element like that. And we can even bind it to a field or set it to the result of a Boolean expression like that one here. No worries, we're gonna see that all in action right now. Let's bind the isDone class to the isDone field. So switch over to the template. And here, where we have the title in line 14 for me, so task title, we want to go ahead and add something into the given tag. So we got that here. Want to go ahead and use class.isDone. And we only want to assign that if task.isDone. So what it does is assign the class.isDone, assign that value, that CSS class, when the task or the property is done of the task is set to true. So isDone, let's see that again. isDone is this field here. Just I really want to make it as sure as possible so that you can understand it. isDone can be true or false. So in the end, it would be like class, should I assign the isDone CSS class to the object, true or false, even depending on if the task is done or is not, right? So this is pretty simple Boolean values here. Okay, so now let's see what that does. Inside of the application, click on done. Oh, you can now see visit n. All right, let's do that with go to gym. All right, cool, that works. I mean, there are some visual aspects which really don't look very nice right now, but we will fix that just in a second. However, from the functional side, it starts working. All right, let's continue here. We are inside of the loop here, ng4, right? And we can make use of the index. Right now, this is behaving like a for each loop, if you know one from another programming language. However, we can also get the index of the iterator. So let's assign a semicolon here, and let's use the index to equals to index. So I equals to index. Now we can use I and know if we are like on index 1 or 10, right? Depending on how much elements we have in the array and how far we have processed in the iteration. Okay, so now this way we can use the index. For the table row, you can see that we always use the class even here, right? There was a difference before. We had that even and odd and even and odd, and it was gray and dark gray and light gray and dark gray and light gray, always in the mix. Okay, so let's do exactly the same stuff here. We again, Angular class dot even, depending on, now we write down a Boolean expression I for index, modulo 2, so is there any remainder, and then equals to 0. So 1 is odd, 2 is even, 3 is odd again, 4 is even, right? This is exactly what's happening here. This is the modulo operator. You should definitely know that. This takes care about even, that makes sense. And now let's add that same stuff for class.odd, but this time the rest value is not null, and therefore we can just remove it like this, for example, or you can write down is not null. Okay, let's see that in action again. And that looks nice again. So click on done, 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 done. Okay, now we got even and odd assigned. That works fine. Now let's take care of that line through visual mistake here. The issue is coming from that pre-formatted text here. So we can get rid of it and just write down P for paragraph, and for sure we need to adjust the closing tag too. However, now you can see that just in a second. If we take a look at the app now, you can see that our margin is gone. So the text is now very close to the left side. But once we click on done, everything looks fine now. So the line through looks great. Let's adjust the margin. Let's just provide here some space. Go into the CSS file. And now let's take a look at TR, which is the table row. Text align left, we got that right here. And inside that table row, we have table data. We can add some space there. So let's add a TD for table data. And what we want to provide here is margin left. And as a value, we want to use 1 rem, for example. So let's take a look. Awesome. So now you can see it's not that close on the left side, right? So there is some space that looks better. And the visual effect is still working fine. Okay, very cool. Now you have learned how you can add CSS classes really depending on a field of a class, for example, or on a component's property or whatever. However, this is just really dynamic. So class is done depending on a Boolean value. This is very, very important because this is what you want to use a lot of times in a real world scenario. We can also write Boolean expressions like this to conditionally write a string somewhere, for example. So let's switch over and do it like that so that we can change the text from a task which is done to be undo. And if it's not done, then the text should be done for sure. Inside of app-component.html, you can see that button mark as done right here for me in line 19. And that text here done. We want to switch it. So once the task is marked as done, the text should be undone and not done anymore. So let me just add 2 line breaks here. That's easier. So let's add double curly braces. If task dot is done, right, we add a Boolean expression here, then the text will be undo, and in any other scenario the text should be done. So if the task is done, the text of the button should be undo, and in any other scenario, which would be that the task is not done, the text of the button should be done. Now we need to make some refactoring here, because we now no longer set the button to be only done, right? We later want to switch it back, so use it as a toggle. So is it done? You click again. No, it's not done. You click again. Yes, it's done. You click again. No, it's not done, right? So instead of having it like a one-time button, we will implement it like a switch so that you can really turn on and off a to-do item, for example, if you just misclicked. So let's switch over to our app-component.ts. Scroll a little bit up until you come to mark is done. Now right click on that and let's click on rename symbol. Let's call it toggle is done. Now let's hit enter, save it, switch over to app component and also change it here, toggle is done. Okay, let's start the application and take a look. When I click on done, you can see the text changes to undone. Done, 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 and all of them now are undone. For sure we have no functionality for toggling them, but that's what's up next. But right now we have really done already a lot of stuff depending on the current state of an object, for example. So let's go ahead into our code, into the app-component.ts, and toggle is done, instead of always setting it to true, set it to the value which it is not. So if it's true, you will set it to false, and if it's false, you will set it to true, and so on. So always set it to the different Boolean value. So if it's true, it will be false, and if it's false, it will be true. And that's an ongoing circle. This is how a switch or a toggle is working for sure. Let's take a look at our application again. There we go. Done, undone, done, undone. And you can see that also the text changes, and for sure we can also see that the line through disappears depending on the current state. And this is because we have bound all of these classes dynamically to the field is done of the task. Now we need to refactor one more thing, and then we are done with that functionality. Let's take a look here in app-component.ts. We got our app component. Inside we got a title, we got tasks, we have a function for adding a new task, and we have a functionality for removing task. However, the toggle is done method that we got right here, that should not be part of the app component because it's related to a single task. So let's copy it and let's bring it into the class task, because toggling one task is related to that task, and therefore from a good or best practices side of view, we should use that method and bring it inside of the task and not of the component. Awesome. So if we do it like this, we can for sure also remove the parameter here. So toggle is done is always then changing the is done field of that specific object. Now we can just say this dot is done. This dot is done. Exactly this way. So this dot is done equals to whatever this dot is done is not. Awesome. Okay, so now we have a method inside of the task which is toggling the given object. What we now need to do to make that complete is switch over to app component HTML. Here you can see toggle is done. What we now do is for sure we remove the task from the parameter here, or as an argument. What we do is we call task.toggle is done, because the task, you can see that right here, it is a task object, right? It's an object of type task, and therefore we can for sure call the method toggle is done, because we got that right here, toggle is done. Awesome. So again, save it, go to our application, test it, because we made some changes, so we want to see if everything is still working, and that's absolutely fine. Very cool. Oh, you can see when you click on delete, you can see object, object. That's pretty interesting. So let's see where this is coming from. As always, if some mistakes are happening during recording, I will leave them inside. I will not cut them out, because you can then see how I would usually go ahead and fix those issues. So let's switch to our project, go into app-component.ts, and it was by removing, you can see user confirm, are you sure that you want to remove the following task? Existing task dot title. That's what we need to add here. Awesome. Okay, let's save it and take a look again. So let's click on done and undo, and then on remove, and you can now see, are you sure you want to remove the following task? Visit and now it's working again. So previously we were referencing the whole object, but now we are again, because we added the title later on, we are now really connecting the task title and not the task object. And this is usually when you see that object, then you have referenced the entire object and not a specific variable or property. All right, so everything else really looks fine. That's very, very cool. Great. Now you can also see, I'm not sure if you have noticed that, but if we say go to the mall and we add that 3 times in a row, for example, before we added the class and I click on delete, it deleted all of the items because, well, they had the same name and we filtered only by name. But now we are really filtering by object instance. And now once I remove go to the mall, it only deletes the one that I really select, even if they all share exactly the same name. Great, so the main functionality of this small application is already completed, and you have really achieved that using bare Angular, right? So some event binding here, some input stuff there, some local referencing, some Boolean binding expression, and for sure some conditional single class binding. I mean, that's what you have learned so far, and there's a lot more to discover, and we will extend this application really by a lot because there are a lot of more concepts and functionalities that you need to discover in Angular. So now that we have the first part here finished, let's move on with the next stuff. We already talked about components, and we saw the app component right here with its template, so HTML, CSS and TypeScript file. Now, how can we create a new component? Because as you already know, components are the building blocks of Angular. So in order to create a new component, we can run a command from our terminal. So notice that I'm right here inside of the folder. So the folder, I changed that after the third or fourth lecture. For you, you may see a different name right here, right? So just write down ng, this is again for Angular, generate component. You can also shorten that nggc, right? So ng generate component or nggc for generate component. But I like it to write that down, generate component. And let's give it a name, and the name is task list. So let's hit enter. You can see that Angular created 4 new files and updated 1. So here we have the creation of the task list component HTML. Then we have the spec file TS, which is for testing. Then we have the TypeScript file, and we have the CSS styling file. And also our app module got well configured. Just think about the app module for now like sort of the root of our application where we register our components. We will get to that later on, but just so that you know why something here got updated. Now on the left side, inside of the app folder, you can see a new folder appearing now. You can see that in green here, task list. And if we collapse that or open that up, you can see task list component.css, HTML, spec.ts and TypeScript. All right, so here is our new component. Now open up the app component.ts and let's move all of the content from here. Let me just close that terminal. Let's move all the content from here, beginning with the tasks, into our new tasks list component. So what I do is from tasks here, everything add remove class tasks. So really everything, I will just copy that, remove it now so that the class app component looks like this. Let me just add that curly brace. So it should look like this for you now. Now let's switch over to task list component.ts. And here under ng on init, we will get to that later on. Just Control V to paste it in. Here I got a brace too much. And now let me just remove that one curly brace. There we go. And now we have that inside of our task list component.ts instead of our app component. Awesome. So we can save it like this. Let's close it. We have to repeat that step also for our template. So go ahead and open up the app component.html and the task list component.html so that we really now transfer all of those things over. So let me just copy everything here and let's remove it from the app component HTML and let's paste it here. That way you can now see that we should remove the title because we don't have that in our app component. We could also leave it here if you like, but we will just get rid of it because we don't need it. Or what you can do is you can just copy it, save it like this, and we can also for sure bring it here into a like H1 for example, right? So we could potentially edit like this just so that you know that we can use the title here, but I don't want to have that, so I will keep that empty. Okay, so and the last thing that we have to do is we for sure also need to move the styling. So now open up the app component.css. Now let's select everything here, app component, CSS. Let's remove it from here. We want to save that and then go to task list component and then paste it in again. Awesome. And now for me, I will start the application. So just ng serve. And for you, if your application is already running, you can just visit the application, take a look. Everything should still be working now. And with working, I don't mean that we can see anything, right? We will not see anything, but we don't have any compilation errors. Awesome. So let's take a look here. Great. So you can see we have no compilation errors because we can visit everything, right? And we can see that compiled successfully here. But now we need to really take care of displaying our new component, because initially it was like we had the app component, but now we don't have any content in the app component. However, it's still rendered, but it's empty. And we now have to place our task list component into the initial app component. And for this, we use the selector. And you have already seen that. If you go to any component into the TypeScript file, you can see that selector here, and app task list. This is the selector we have to use to display the component. So go to app component, because that app component here, this one is always rendered. And now what we want to do is we want to switch over to the HTML of that. So app component, and then go to app component HTML. Now that one is empty for sure. Now let's call the selector. What you want to do is you want to use that as an HTML tag. So open up those tags and then write down exactly how the selector here is defined. App task list. Write that down, just like that, add a closing tag too. And this will force Angular to render the HTML of the app task list and display all of the content. So let's compile it. Let's visit our application again. Well, and you can see that we now have the component. And as I said, it's a building block, right? So if we want to have that again, well, we could simply go ahead and use that. In another HTML file, we could simply, again, just include all of that, and Angular will automatically render the app task list component, including all of the functionality provided from the TypeScript files, which are included from the component. So right now, if I take a look at the application, you can see that we now have 3 components here, right? So, and we don't have to duplicate that over and over again. No, we just have to set an HTML tag like you would do that with a paragraph or whatever. So very, very simple. This is why component is, or you can see a component as a building block, right? Because you can compose inside of a new HTML file, you can just compose your components without having to rewrite them and reorganize them all the time. Now, to be a little bit more specific on this, a component encapsulates the visual interface, data, and behavior of a piece of UI. And you can include it into other components by using its selector and treating it like an HTML tag. Now, if you want to rename the selector, you can for sure do that. Let's remove the app task list. Let's just call the selector task list for sure. And that's one of the nice things. The compilation will now fail because he has no app task list anymore. We need to for sure adjust that here so that we only include the correct selector. And now it's compiled again. Awesome. So now you have created your first component. And yeah, basically, we have that app component, which is our starting point in the Angular application, right? That is the component which is always provided by default. But now you have created a brand new component. We just brought in the functionality, we just copy pasted it there. And then you now have a component which you can use everywhere. Okay, now that you know that we have a task list component, which we can use like an HTML tag, we can style our app component HTML a little bit more so that we add sort of a basic structure here. First of all, what we do is we will add a header here. So add a header tag, and inside of that header tag, let me just zoom in a little bit inside of that header tag, and let me just get that a little bit smaller here. Header tag, we will just write down task list, for example, and then we can create a body. So open up a body tag and put that task list inside of that body tag. Okay, save it. Okay, now you can go to Git and copy the app component CSS for the header. So what I do is I go again to the CSS file and paste it right into that file. All right, there we go. And we have a linear gradient background for the header, and we have a like font family set and some styling, right? Okay, so let's take a look at the application. Okay, so this is how it looks now. We now got that nice header here, but the space between the header and our component is a little bit too much, so we could go ahead and just remove that padding now. So go into task list component.css, and then let's simply take a look right here for the padding. So just scroll to the very top. And here you can see the padding top. You can adjust the value, you can completely remove it just as you like, depending on your wishes for sure. Now this definitely looks way better. Initially we set the padding just so that when we first started the application, the component wasn't really at the very, very top, because that always looks a little bit weird. Awesome, so now it looks definitely way better. As I said, components are the primary building blocks of an Angular application, and you should never forget that. You can compose different components together to create an entire page. App component is the root component of our application. It's always provided by default. It's called the bootstrap component. In an Angular application, other components usually load into the app component. So exactly what we have done. We have the app component, and inside the app component we load our task list component. But how do applications distinguish between the bootstrap and the rest of the components? Now let's take a look at the app module. I already talked about that just to give you an idea. The add-ng module directive accepts a bootstrap property which contains the bootstrap component. You might wonder what a module is, right? Modules are TypeScript classes. You can see that right here. They can package multiple components. Whenever we create a new component using the Angular CLI, it automatically adds the new component to the declarations array of the module, right? Just think back. When we created our component, you saw 4 create statements, like create a new HTML, CSS, and TypeScript file, and you also saw that update app module, right? And this is what happened. Inside of our app module, the task list component was added into the declarations array. And this declarations array contains the components that this module packages. So if you remove the task list component from the declarations array of the app module, the app component won't be able to load it anymore, and calling its selector will throw errors. The app module is the main module of an Angular application that Angular creates automatically when you generate a new application using the Angular CLI. You can also create new modules on your own. You can create as many modules as you want and package some components into each. You can import the module to another to share its components with the importer. To create a new module, we can run the ng generate module in the root directory of the project and then name the module. Angular creates a new folder with the module's name then, when the folder doesn't exist already, and generates the module class into the folder. Now let's open up the app module. You can find this in the Explorer if you take a look right here. App module.ts is also inside of the app folder. Let's create a new module with the name task list by running this command at the root of the project. So go to the terminal, or you can open up a new one for sure. However, you can see the PowerShell here. Let's write down ng, G for generate, module. Let's call it task list. You can now see that we have a task list module.ts. Now let's remove the task list component from the app module. You got that right here. So task list component, let's cut that out. We can also remove the import statement right here. Let's just get rid of it. Let's open up our new module, which is the task list module right here. We can now import again that statement or that module. So import task list component from task list component. And then inside of the declarations, we got that right here. We can now task list component so that we add it right here. Awesome. So now we have created our own module and added the task list component, right? Awesome. And based on the last presentation, you know that the task list module is now able to render or display the task list component. Now to make a class importable to other files, we should export it. And once we export the class, other files can import that class by using its relative address, just like you can see it right here. But that's just about TypeScript, right? And Angular has its own system for importing and exporting components from modules. As an example, importing the class of a component to a module file is not enough for being able to use the component selector in other Angular components. To be able to use the selector of a component in other components, we should declare the component in the declaration section or import it from another module that declares the component. And the module that declares the component should also export it to make it accessible by other components. Now let's export the task list component from the to-do list module. So switch over to task list module right here. And here you can see the imports, and we will just extend that. Add a comma here, write down exports, just like that, make it an array, and write down task list component. Now we need to switch over and import the to-do list module into the app module. So switch over, save that here, to the app module now. Here add the import statements. Let's write down import task list module, and that module for sure exports the task list component so we can use it. So what we can do here inside of our imports, we can simply add the task list module now. Awesome. And in that way we can again render our task list component from the app module, because it imports the task list module, which exports the task list component. Now let's take a look at our application and check if everything is still working. And as you can see, everything is still working fine. Perfect. So now we have generated a new module and attached the task list component to it. However, we exported it and set up everything in a way that our app module is still able to show the content of that component. Okay, now it's time to get started with some new functionality. We want to bring in a calendar page. So what we will do now is we will create a module and a component for the calendar page. So go ahead into your project and let's first of all generate a new module and name it calendar. So ng gm calendar. Angular generate module with the name calendar. Let's hit enter. Awesome. So on the left side you can see a new folder called calendar, and inside there we got a calendar module. Now let's create a new component. ng-gc for Angular generate component calendar. Make sure the first comment was creating a module, and now we are creating a component. So let's hit enter. The component again consists out of 4 files, which is ts, spec.ts, html and css. You can see that right here. Oh, and you can see it automatically updated the calendar module. So let's take a look at the calendar module, and you can see that it now declares the calendar component automatically updated because it's like the same root folder, right? It's the same root, which is calendar. Awesome. Now let's export that calendar component. In ng module, here we got imports. Again, we add a section for exports, and it exports the calendar component so that we can use it later on from anywhere else. Let's switch over to our app module.ts and let's import the calendar module. So here we got import task list module. For sure we can just do the same thing with our calendar module. There we go. Now inside of the imports we will now also import the calendar module, which again gives us the possibility to display the calendar component. Now let's switch over to our app component.html because we now want to extend it here. Here we got our body, here we got our task list component. Let's add the app calendar component, app calendar. There we go. So now let's take a look at our application. Perfect. And as you can see on the left side, you can see calendar works. And this is the actual proof that we can see the content of our calendar component. Let's see why I can prove that, because when I go to the calendar folder and here we get the calendar component HTML, you can see calendar works, and this is exactly the paragraph which we can see at our website right now. Okay, so within 3 minutes of video, in under 3 minutes you have just created a brand new module and a component, you have exported it and then show the content of that new component inside of the app module. Great, now it's time to really make that thing a calendar. Now it's time to bring in some beautiful UI into our application, and for that we use the very famous Angular material library. You can check that out by your own if you like. I just want to show you what package we're using. It's material.angular.io, and as I said, you can check it out on your own. We will use that for our calendar page. Okay, so let's add Angular material. And the command for this is ng, so Angular add, now write down add Angular/material. That is the name of the package, right? It's not Angular/material, it's add Angular/material. Awesome, so let's hit enter, give it a second to load. Okay, so the package information is loaded and now it wants to install and asks us if we want to proceed, and for sure we want to do that, so type in Y and then hit enter again. Okay, now you can see that it wants us to select a theme. And well, there are a couple of themes here, so let's real quick take a look at them. Let me just open them up. There we go, and the last one, and then we can just have a preview of them. All right, there you go. So it's just about the theme, right? So here we got one indigo pink. Let's see, purple green. We got pink, blue, gray, and deep purple, amber. So go ahead and just check whatever style you like, right? You can also click on components here and then get a preview of really a lot of stuff. And we'll proceed with that pink, blue, gray, because well, that color is really related to our company branding color. So let me proceed with pink, blue, gray right here. You can just use the arrow keys and then hit enter. Set up global Angular material typography styles. Let's write down yes. And then include the Angular animations module. Yes, we also want to do that. So include and enable. Let's hit enter then. Okay, so now the package got installed successfully and we can see some update statements here for angular.json, index, HTML, style.css, and a lot of stuff. So let's take a look on what happens if we add a new dependency, for example, a package just like that one right here. So adding new dependencies. Other developers may have encountered some of the problems you face, and many times they have solved it and shared the code as an open source library to make the job of other developers easier. You can install those libraries in your Angular application as a dependency to actually use them. To add a new package or dependency, you can run ng add and then the name of the package you want to install into the root directory of your application. You can alternatively also run npm install and then the name of the package you want to install, but using ng add also configures your application after installation, so this is the preferred way. Now let me show you where you can find the dependencies. If you're just pay attention on the left side right here, you can see that package.json file, right? And here we can see some configurations of our building and watching and starting the application, right? ng-serve and all that. We can configure some stuff here, and you can also see the dependencies right here. Add Angular animations, for example, and also what we just have added, add Angular material. So for sure, if we start an Angular project, we have some, well, default dependencies like Angular core and forms and all of that, but Angular material and animations, for example, just got, well, added by our comment. So if you're wondering what dependencies your application covers, you can check it out right here in the package.json. So when we open up our app module, you can see the browser animations module here, right? So installing the Angular material imports the browser animation module to the app module, but we want to use it in the calendar module instead. So what we need to do is we need to move that browser animation module here to our calendar module. And in order to do that, we will first of all remove it from here. So from the imports, just remove it. And also from that import directive at the very top. So let's get rid of it. Awesome. Now let's open up our calendar module. And again, import it here. So import browser animations module. We want to import it from add Angular/platform browser/animations. There we go. This is the path that we want to use here. And now let's import it here in the module, so browser animations module. Okay, so now we switched it over from app module, we removed it from here and brought it into the calendar module because we want to use that Angular material animations inside of the calendar module for sure. Great, so we can directly stay here because we want to have some more stuff. For example, we want to have a date picker. So let's go ahead and first of all import two more things, the mat date picker module from add Angular /material /date picker. And secondly, we want to import the mat native date module from Angular add Angular /material /core. Awesome. So those two elements, we want to have them imported. So let's go ahead, scroll down and define it here. Mat date picker module and mat native date module. There we go. So mat date picker module, mat native date module. Great, so it's time to bring that in action. Let's open up the calendar component HTML. And because we just, well, imported so many new stuff, we can for sure use the mat calendar HTML tag right here. And if we now start the application, you can see some sort of calendar and a lot of stuff here going on, right? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and you can see August here and you can see all the days, and well, you can even click on all of this, but we need to configure it. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to wrap a div around that. So div, there we go, and inside of that div we have the mat calendar. Perfect. Now we can save it like this and then go to the calendar component.css. And here we want to create some styling for a div, which will then for sure be applied to the div we just created. Let's say display flex and justify content at center. This is the first thing. And for mat calendar, for that tag, we want to set the width to 500 pixels. Okay, save and take a look again. Great, so this is what it looks now. It's already way better because you can really see a lot of more content without having that on the full width of the screen. Okay, so the first thing that we should do now is to restart our Angular project. So close your terminal, for example, here, and run again ng-serve so that the compilation takes place, because then the calendar module will get applied correctly, because right now it was just a little bit kind of bugged. You can definitely tell that because it didn't look very nice, but that was not an issue. So now let's simply restart our application. So let's close that here and let's simply run ng-serve again. And that will result in the fact that our calendar will be displayed in the correct way. Okay, you can now see that it's not really appearing, but that's not an issue. If you can see, you can hover above this. Okay, that's fine. So now the actual style is getting applied nice, but I made a mistake when I selected the theme, because this is what I selected. It's pink, blue, gray, right? So, and it's for a dark mode theme for sure, because the content then is white. And instead what I should have picked instead of pink, blue, gray is indigo pink. So I just made a mistake there. We want to use that because that one is made for a white background at first place. So the fastest way to fix that issue with the wrong theme is to simply go ahead and remove Angular material. If you want to do that, please go ahead. So let's open up a new PowerShell here and let's simply npm uninstall add Angular /material, because previously we used ng-add, but there is no reverse ng-add, right? So you cannot ng-remove or something like that. So as I already told you, ng-add and npm install are like equivalents, but ng-add adds some more configuration to our project. However, now it got removed. So let's just again ng-add Angular /material. Okay, so now again, let's proceed here. because that is by far really the fastest way. If you want to switch the theme, you can definitely modify the theme, but you have some real struggles if you in the end want to change the theme. So the fastest way is to get rid of the entire package and then just reinstall it. And it's, however, a good practice in installing and removing packages and dependencies and all of that. As you can see, we are now again here at the theme selection. And this time I will not pick pink, blue, gray. I will instead pink, indigo / pink. That was the one that we should use. Setup, Angular material, yes, include and enable. All right. So let's see what happens now, because I assume that when we go to the app modules, just in a second after the installation is completed, we again have to remove the browser animations module. So let's take a look. You can see AngularJSON app modules.ts got configured, and you can see we again have that here, browser animations module. Let's get rid of it as we did before. That's all we have to do. Now, what we do now is, let me just close all of the terminals. Let me open a new one and again call ngserve, so that we this time force really every package to be included and compiled successfully. Great. When you now take a look at your application, then you can see a nice calendar. Awesome. So this is how it should look like for sure. Okay, now we can move on. We want the calendar and the task list component to be on two completely different pages, right? We don't want both of them right here. So as you see, Angular Material Library contains some components that do a lot of otherwise time-consuming work for us, right? Since Angular Material is outside of the scope of this course, you can learn more about it by reading the documentation on it at material.angular.io. However, we will still use some components of it. Okay, awesome. So now that we got all the visuals fixed again, we can proceed to the next topic, which is routing. And as I said earlier, we for sure want separate sites. So we don't want to have the task list and the calendar on the same site, because in real world applications, you also want to have multiple sites, each with its own content. Let's go to the app component HTML site. Let me just close that. We go to app component.html. And what we want to add here is we want to add a so-called router outlet. So now pay attention. I remove both of the entries right here and put in a router outlet tag. And we will have to configure that. You can see that just in a second. So we want to load components dynamically to the app module as the user selects a link, for example. And the router outlet enables us to load a component at runtime based on user decisions. And that is exactly what we want to have here. No worries, it will get clear. First of all, we need to assign a link to each component to enable the user to replace the router outlet with the component the user clicks its link. So if we, for example, want to go to our calendar page, router outlet here will be replaced with the calendar, right? So just think of it that way. Let's open up the app routing module. You can find that right here, app routing module. We should assign each component a URL. A component and its URL both together are called a route. We can specify an array of routes for an application in the routes array, right here at the top of the file. So let's define a route for the calendar component. First of all, we need to add the calendar component, right? So let's do that. Import calendar component from calendar.component. Nice. Now we get our routes. You can see them right here, and it's an array. And inside of that array, we want to define a new route. So let's do that. Let's add a new object. Component is calendar component, and path, we'll keep that empty for now, just like that. So now we have defined a new path for the calendar component, and the path is like just a home page, because we don't provide any specific path here. So what I mean is, to load the component into the router outlet by default when the app starts, we simply set the path to be an empty string as we do it right here. So our calendar component is our default starting site. Let's take a look at our application. And you can see that we only have that component right here. So right now we have no way to go to our task list. So let's go ahead and add a new route for the tasks. Inside of that routes array, we just want to extend it and add a new path. So add a comma, add a new object, set the component to be task list component. There we go. It automatically adds the import statement, right? Just in case you didn't know. And then we set the path this time for sure not to be empty, but tasks. So in the end, we will reach that page by writing localhost blah 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 port / tasks. So let's save like this. And again, take a look at the application. Now let's go to the URL bar and write down /tasks, right? So localhost : 4200. For me, that's my port. Yours might be different. /tasks. And you can see that when we hit enter, get to that URL, and we can now see that component. And what happens in the background is that the component in the router outlet switches. So right now the router outlet contains the task component or the task list component. And when I go back to our start page or home page, we will see the calendar component. And this is, well, all driven by the user decision. And this is what we call routing. Okay, so next up, we want to assign some tasks for a certain date. So let's say on 11th of August, for example, we want to have some specific tasks, right? Because this is the application that we want to build. We don't want to have a so simple application where we just have a very long to-do app. No, we want to have like a scheduler where we have a calendar, and inside of that calendar, you can pick a date, and then on that date, you can see your to-do items, for example. Pretty cool. So we need to move on here. And before we want to take care of that new functionality, we just want to add like a link to a different page so that we can swap between the pages. So go to the calendar component.html. Got that right here, calendar component.html. And here at Mat Calendar below, we want to just add a simple A tag, which is an anchor, just in case you didn't know. And let's call it tasks. And we set an href, so a target destination, right? But in Angular, we do it different. We use the router link, and we set the value to be of /tasks, exactly as we have defined it. Awesome. Okay, now let me just add those double quotes. There we go. Okay, because this is how you assign a value in HTML. So you can see that it's not compiling, but that's not a problem because we now go into the calendar module. All right, don't go into the component, go into the calendar module. And here we simply add an import statement, and we import the router module, and that gives us the possibility to use that. So go into imports and also here import the router module. That's awesome. Now you can see the compilation error of the HTML file is gone. We could get an A tag, router link to tags and all of that. Perfect. So now let's add some simple styling. Go to calendar component.css and let's, inside of the div here, add a flex direction, set it to column, and line items, set it to center. There we go. Now let's take a look at the application again. You can now see at the bottom of the screen that tasks link here, right? And if I click on that, I'll get to the tasks list. And this is how you can, for example, create a nav menu or something else, right? So this is how you can use the router to create an A tag, so an anchor, to link to a different component, right? So this is the Angular way of creating navigation. Awesome. So now let's really extend our functionality of the application and talk about two-way data binding. Okay, now let's use some two-way data binding for our calendar component. So open up the calendar component.TypeScript. There we go. And when I scroll a little bit down here after the ng on init lifecycle hook, which we will cover, well, it takes some time until we get to it, but we will cover the ng on init lifecycle hook, so no worries. Right here, I will create a new field called selected date. And the value is a new date, right? So this is an object here, new date object, right? So that we can really store the information about like 11th of August 2022, for example, inside of a variable or field or property or whatever you want to call it. Now, let's switch over to our calendar component.html. We got that right here. And now inside of the Mat calendar, we can really configure that date so that it is pre-selected when we launch the application. And for this, we simply go inside of the Mat calendar opening tag here, and then have the brackets, and inside of the brackets, the parentheses, and then we write down selected, and selected is equals to selected date. That's for sure the property. Now what we also want to do is we want to show it here. So let's use the binding syntax 2 times curly braces. Let's set selected date dot to local date string. Awesome. So let's save it like that and open it up so that we can take a look. All right, as you can see, for me it's 11th of August, and that one is now pre-selected because that's the date today. And when we create a new object of type date, so new date, it's always set to the current date. Great, so you can see 11th of August 2022. This is handled by the to local date string. But what does two-way data binding mean? We will cover that again later on. But let me tell you that when I click on 15 here, for example, the date, you can see that here, is now set to 15. So by clicking on the new date here, we update our field, right? Our property. So when we start the application, we read the value one way, and when I click somewhere else on 2022, for example, we update the value, the property, and this is called two-way data binding. So I can read the value and automatically update it, and once it's changed, it's getting read and displayed again. This is two-way data binding for reading and setting and updating, right? Awesome. Now let's take a look at parameterized router links, and this is very important if you want to transfer some data information from link A to link B, let's call it like this, right? So if you change your route, so your URL, you want to take some information from A to B. So when a user clicks a link to load a component, for example, we can set up parameters for that route inside of the route definition. And afterwards, we can receive those route parameters from the ng-on-init lifecycle hook of the newly loading component. Now let's send the selected date to the task list component. Inside of our calendar component.html, here we got our A tag, and we will now modify it. You can see that we are redirecting the H tag to /tasks route. Now let's extend that, add a comma, and let's add a new object and set the date to selected date, which is the property selected date in our calendar component. Awesome, because we also used it here, right? So for sure we can also use it here in an A tag. So what happens now is once we go to /tasks, in the URL browser box, right, where you can see the URL, you will also see a parameter called date with the selected or with the current value of the selected date property. Now let me show you that. So here we are at our page, and when I select, for example, the 16th of August and I click on tasks, you can see in the browser box right here in the URL bar, Tuesday 20th of August, for example. Okay, so now we got it in the browser URL bar, so we are submitting the information, but now we for sure need to read it here inside of our task list. We need to read it from the URL or route. So switch over to our task list component.ts, not the calendar, right? Because now we want to adjust it in the task list. We are sending the information from the calendar component to the task list by using the route. Awesome, so task list component.ts, and inside here we want to make use of the router. So let's import two things here: the activated route, which is the current route when you're on a website, for example, and we for sure want to use the route object. So there we go, we can grab both from @Angular router. Now inside of that export class task list component, you can see implements on init, and this is the lifecycle hook, and on init or ng-on-init will get called once the component is loaded. Great. So the first thing that we have to do before we go to that ng-on-init here, inside of the constructor, we now need to go ahead and configure the route. So let's say private route activated route, so that we can really use the value of the current route in the browser, right? Now let's switch over to the ng-on-init lifecycle hook, and let's write down var date, for example, of type date equals to new date. We create a new date, and now we read the value from the route. So this dot route dot snapshot, so we make a snapshot of the current route, take the params, so params, and let's from that params fetch the date object, so date or the key or its specific value in that case, and then log the information, so console .log date, so that we can really verify that everything is working as expected. So save it like this and let's check for that. Let me open up the console, Ctrl-Shift-J in Google Chrome at least. And now when I go back to our tasks calendar, there we go. Let me select the 24th of August, for example, and I go to tasks now. You can see that we got an entry here, and since it's set to locale, this is German for me, right? So because it applied it in the German way, but for you it may be different depending on wherever you are. And yeah, that's the log. So this got read from the actual route, which you can see at the browser URL bar. So we're sending it from the calendar component to the task list component, and we are able to actually read it in the task list. So our task list now knows on which date the user has clicked before. So we now can filter or can set up the system where we say now only show the tasks for that specific date. Okay, you now have reached the end of our free Angular course here on YouTube, and if you want to continue, you want to go to our all access subscription, right? An info card is popping up right now because you can sign up there and start your 7-day free trial. And there you can continue with the rest of this course. It's about 4 hours in total, so 4 hours more content, right? In total, the course is about 6 hours long. So you now had 2 hours here for free on YouTube, and the rest of the course is inside of that subscription. You can start it for free right away, 7 days, continue the course. And if you like to learn something else, we recommend ASP.NET Core right here, right? So that should be your natural next step. You can for sure continue learning or cancel your subscription at any time. However, as I already said at the beginning of the video, if you are more interested in an absolutely serious way so that you really proceed on your journey as a developer to become a senior developer, we suggest you to join our Angular and ASP.NET Core Challenge. So for that you will need some basic C# knowledge, but if you have that basic knowledge about C#, you should definitely take that course. Inside there you will learn how to use Angular and ASP.NET Core to build a real application. In that course you will build a flight booking portal, which you can see right here. Now I'm absolutely sure that there is no way to increase your value as a programmer faster than taking this online course, and I guarantee you that you have never seen a course just like that. It took us months to create this course, and the students are absolutely amazed by its quality. So if you want to take a look at it, go ahead and check out the link to that course in the description below. So thanks for watching this video. My name is Yannick, and I would be happy to see you next time in another video. Definitely don't forget to smash the like button if you're interested in that Angular interview question video. And for sure subscribe to our channel because you don't want to miss our programming courses right here on that YouTube channel.